Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to you. Welcome to Westminster College. My name's Rob Havers, the Executive Director of the Churchill Institute, and I welcome you to Westminster's 4th Annual Symposium on Democracy and the first sponsored by the Churchill Institute. Thank you very much. I'd like to say a big thank you also to our sponsors for this event, the Missouri Foundation for Health, and also to Pfizer. At this juncture, too, I would like to make the perennial request: if you have a cell phone, if you have a pager, please turn it off now. Well, through the presentations you attend over the next 2 days, you will explore one of the most important topics of our time, that of global health and the myriad aspects connected to this enormous topic. We are all familiar, of course, with the statistics associated with disease, with prevention, and with its cure all around the world. Indeed, of course, the United States is currently in the middle of a huge debate about the future of healthcare and what shape that provision may take in the future. Over the next 2 days, we will learn a great deal more about the challenges associated with accessing quality healthcare and some of the possible solutions. As the symposium schedule indicates, an impressive array of authorities on a wide range of healthcare topics will be joining us to share their thoughts and to make us think also. For Westminster students, you will also have the opportunity to win one of 2 iPod Touches that we are giving away by entering our Symposium I Challenge. If you want to participate, please pick up a wristband akin to this in the lobby of Champ Auditorium. Attend at least 3 symposium sessions and have your wristband punched on each occasion. Once you receive at least 3 punches, you can turn the band in with your name on it, and once you turn in 1 wristband, you can pick up another and increase your chances of winning an iPod by attending another 3 sessions. So please turn these in the lobby of Champ Auditorium, or at the Symposium office in Coulter Science Center, or at the main Symposium office in Washington West building. Well, now let's get the symposium underway with our initial speaker. Dr. Nathan Wolfe is a professor at Stanford University and founder and director of the Global Viral Forecasting Institute, an acclaimed research institute monitoring disease outbreaks in Asia and in Africa. While some in his field try to track down what has caused a specific disease epidemic, such as HIV, SARS, or West Nile, to name just a few, Dr. Wolfe is trying to discover what can be done about a new threatening virus when it first occurs. His goal is to eradicate the stage. His goal is to reach the stage where he can eradicate pandemics before they even happen. Google and the Skoll Foundation have given him over $11 million in funding to pursue his research. Dr. Wolfe's groundbreaking work has been featured on a popular CNN special with Anderson Cooper, and Rolling Stone magazine has named him one of their top 100 agents of change. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Dr. Nathan Wolfe.
Thank you, Professor Havers, President Forsyth, and all of Westminster College for having me here. I'd like to begin for a moment just to ask all of you to think to yourself about the beginnings of the AIDS pandemic. When do you sort of think of this particular pandemic as having begun? For many of you, the beginnings of the AIDS pandemic, you'll be thinking about something like the 1980s. For people of my generation, this picture is very evocative, Magic Johnson being one of the first public figures that we really knew of who was infected with HIV. In fact, HIV as a virus had entered into human populations in the early parts of the 20th century, perhaps even earlier. By the time this particular photo was taken before the Great Depression in Brazzaville, Congo, this virus had already crossed from chimpanzees over into human populations and infected thousands, if not tens of thousands of individuals in Central Africa, 1929. Okay? And there's a really profound question that all of you should be asking yourself, which is, if this is a virus that entered into human populations, perhaps in the 19th century or the early 20th century, if it was already infecting people at the time of this picture, why did it take us until the 1980s to recognize this pandemic? Why did it take us until 1981 to actually identify the syndrome that was killing individuals? Why did it take us until 1984 to know that this was a disease which was caused by a virus, HIV? And why did it take us until 1986 or 87 before the President of the United States even would acknowledge the disease by using the word AIDS in public addresses? Okay, this is, I think, a very, very profound question for us. Why is there such an incredible delay? And importantly, what would have been, how would the world have been different had we understood this virus, perhaps not at this time in 1929, but let's say in the 50s or 60s? How many lives could we save? How much could we have changed the world by knowing about this? Now, many people will say, okay, a virus, this is something which is completely random. You're not going to be able to predict the course of a pandemic. But the reality is there are many features to the way that pandemics occur which are in fact quite predictable. This is based on some work that we did looking at the origins of the major diseases. So we went through and we said, what are the 20 or 30 most important diseases of humanity and how did they originate? And the answer is, there's many common features to them. If you look at this is sort of the way that we think about this bubbling up of diseases into human populations. So the reality is, one of the major things that we discovered is that the vast majority of human diseases actually originate in animal populations. Okay, so there are animals out there, whether they be domestic animals like pigs or chickens, wild animals like chimpanzees and monkeys. All of these animals have their own particular viral diseases. And then there are human populations who have contact with these animals, whether it be farmers, whether it be hunters, whether it be individuals who have pet animals. And there's a constant flow of viruses from these animals into human populations. Now, the reality is most of these go nowhere. Okay, so if you go back to where I used to live in Venice, California, where you walk into a store and people have food for the various dogs there. People are kissing their dogs. There's a constant movement of microorganisms, bacteria and viruses to the people who have this kind of contact. Most of those go nowhere, though. Only a small fraction of these particular diseases that transmit here actually become transmissible and go on to become sort of at the top of this pathogen pyramid by really being things that infect us and spread among humans. For example, things like H1N1. The so-called swine flu. Nevertheless, the history of the way that we deal with global disease control is basically that we focus right here on things that have already become completely sort of integrated into the human species. We don't look at this earlier level, okay, where humans are first the sort of portal of entry whereby viruses are entering into human populations. The point at which a chimpanzee virus enters into a human and will go on to become HIV, or a swine virus enters into a human and go on to be H1N1, or Ebola, or on and on. All of these things work in the same way. And basically what we wanted to do is to follow this level, what we think of as sort of viral chatter. The movement, the chattering of these viruses. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of intelligence chatter. Intelligence chatter is the idea that you could monitor communications, say monitor cell phone communications and email communications, and look for particular keywords that would give you a sense of a possible terrorist event. Okay, maybe something like bomb will be too generic, but if intelligence agencies monitor and they catch a word that's the name of a particular plastic explosive, maybe that's something that they really want to respond to. And there's this constant chattering of information, and if you look through it carefully, you may find the clues that'll give you a sense of impending terrorist disaster. And basically, this is what we're doing with respect to understanding viruses. We're following this chatter of viruses as they enter into human populations, trying to see the patterns by which we could really potentially predict what would be the next major viral disaster. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, if we understand that these viruses by and large come from animal populations, we want to work with people who are at this interface, people who have a tremendous amount of contact with the blood and body fluids of animals. And so one of the populations we've spending a lot of time with is hunters, just like this individual who's hunted a baboon in Central Africa. Now, if you look here, it's a little bit difficult to see in this light, but there's a tremendous amount of contact with blood and body fluids of this animal. And what that means is a rich possibility of viruses to be jumping over from animals into human populations. And it's exactly this sort of way that HIV entered into the human population. And now I just want to give you, just for a minute, to show you an excerpt of a video with Anderson Cooper in some of our sites, just to give you a sense of our work.
Searching for bushmeat. Forest animals they can kill to feed their families.
Patrice and Petit set out most days to go out hunting in the forest around their homes. They have a series of traps and snares that they've set up to catch wild pigs, snakes, monkeys, rodents, anything they can, really.
Patrice and Petit have been out for hours but found nothing. The animals are simply gone. We stop for a drink of water. Then there's a rustle in the brush. A group of hunters approach. Their packs loaded with wild game.
There's at least 3 viruses that you know about which are in this particular monkey.
This species, yeah. And there's many, many more pathogens that are present in these animals. These individuals are at specific risk, particularly if there's blood contact, they're at risk for transmission and possibly infection with novel viruses.
As the hunters display their kills, something surprising happens. They show us filter paper they've used to collect the animal's blood. The blood will be tested for zoonotic viruses, part of a program Dr. Wolfe has spent years setting up.
So this is from this animal right here, greater spot nose guano. Every person who has one of those filter papers has at least at a minimum been through our basic health education about the risks associated with these activities, which presumably from our perspective gives them the ability to decrease their own risk and then obviously the risk to their families, the village, the country, and the world. Okay, so I'm going to be telling you a lot of details about sort of the work that we do, but before we do that, I want to actually spend a little bit of time on this photo. I mean, first of all, just to sort of, for everybody to get a sense of what emotions this particular photo evokes in you, because it's definitely a particular photo that is evocative and leads to an emotional response. And I definitely feel strongly about what's going on in Central Africa and elsewhere, and I think it's important to take a break to just talk about it for a moment. We are experiencing, at this point in time in history, a profound crisis. And this is a picture which is emblematic of this particular crisis. This is a crisis associated with the hunting and butchering of wild animals. Okay, and many people will probably the first instincts you might have associated with this picture are that it's potentially a very valuable endangered animal and that individuals are hunting these endangered animals, and that's absolutely the case. When your children and grandchildren ask you about this particular time in history, they're going to say to you, how is it that you allowed some of the most valuable endangered species on our planet to be hunted to extinction because we weren't capable of providing enough basic food resources and economic resources to populations, and they resorted to killing some of these incredibly valuable animals. But the truth is, they're going to actually take it another step. They're going to say, why was it the case that you knew that there was profound implications for food security in these locations? Okay, that these were not sustainable sources of nutrients for these populations, and yet you did nothing while they hunted to the brink of extinction these animals and destroy their own food supplies. But the reality is, one of the things that we're seeing is that they're going to ask you yet another set of questions. They're going to say, how is it that you knew that it was these kinds of activities that led to the birth of pandemics, things like HIV, things like SARS, H1N1, and Ebola, and you let these behaviors continue to occur? Okay, so this is not just about sort of a boutique conservation issue that's by sort of a particular organization that loves animals. This is a profound crisis which is really affecting all of us. But they're going to ask another question, a final question, which I think is perhaps one of the most important ones, namely, why did we think it was the responsibility of this individual to address these issues? And just so that you can see, this was from the previous picture. This was the hunter who hunted this particular animal. And I just encourage you to sort of take in this picture a little bit. I mean, look at the individual's shirt, look at his face. What I think is very clear, or should be clear to all of us, is that this crisis cannot be the responsibility of this sort of individual. Okay, this is someone who basically, if they're going to sell the animal that they've hunted, it's for a candle or maybe some rice for their family. This is certainly not the person who's responsible for this particular crisis. And I'm not necessarily advocating a clear answer to this problem. Okay, this is really something for your generation to be thinking about. It's something for you to think very carefully about. That we're witnessing not only the extinction of animals on a global scale, but the introduction of new viruses into human populations and major food security, and that we're going to have to take it seriously. And it can't just be about going to this individual and saying, you can't do these things, this is a bad idea. Even though that is true, that's not going to be the answer to this problem. It's going to take something much more global and something much more substantive to address this issue. And it also, from my perspective, points out how all these things are woven together. Globalization, which was the subject of last year's symposium, or in the environment, which is the symposium before that. These things are all linked together. Health is not just about finding a vaccine and sticking a needle into people. Okay, it's really about understanding the ecology of how some of these things enter into humans, the impact of globalization on moving these things around. Okay, so I'm going to now spend a little bit of time just telling you sort of what it takes to do this sort of research and how we effectively got started. I began doing this research in Cameroon about 10 years ago. This is a picture of Cameroon. I was recruited by Don Burke, who is a colonel at Walter Reed and left to Johns Hopkins, and said, hey, you've been doing some work in Borneo, you're interested in how new viruses are how pandemics are born, why don't you come to Cameroon? I said, great, let's do this. Picked something like 17 sites. I said, no problem, we'll go to all those sites, we'll get really good quality specimens from individuals, we'll ask them all sorts of questions about what kind of animals they hunted. No problem, we'll take care of all this. Needless to say, these can be very challenging places to work. What we found was that it was incredibly difficult to do this work. This is, for example, a picture taken during the rainy season. We learned very quickly that you just can't easily do this sort of work in the rainy season. Fortunately, what happened is that over time I was able to accumulate a wonderful group of colleagues, collaborators, and just an absolutely wonderful team that really permitted us to be able to conduct this work even in some of the most difficult conditions in the world. Now, I thought it might be fun just to give you a few sort of before and after shots to get a sense of what it was that our laboratory looked like early on. This is sort of an early picture of our lab. This gives you a little bit of a sense of what it looks like now. Now what we've done is we've created a space where we can use contemporary molecular biology to discover completely new viruses in animals and humans. And this is what the laboratory looks now. Early on, so one of our big problems is it's not easy. You have to figure out a way to move specimens around, and these specimens need to be kept cold. And so early on, we would go to the local brewery. This is the local brewery in Yaoundé, Cameroon, in the middle of Central Africa. And I don't know how many of you have spent time in, I know a lot of you have probably drink beer, but I don't know how many of you have really spent time in a brewery. One of the things that happens in a brewery is you have an output of carbon dioxide, which is in the form of dry ice. And we would go and we would harvest this dry ice. And I can tell you, it's not that easy to work with breweries, particularly in this part of the world, to get dry ice. Now we actually have gotten the funding to have a liquid nitrogen generator, which actually creates liquid nitrogen, which keeps things incredibly cold. I joke that we have probably the coldest place in Central Africa, right there in our laboratory in Yaoundé. In terms of before and after shots, this is just to give you a sense of sort of me early on. This is a close colleague, Colonel Mpudi Ngole, who's a physician. So this is me before. No comment. That's me there, for those of you who don't recognize me. So what did we actually do after all this time? And the answer is we spent a lot of time really trying to get to the end of the road, to find the places where humans had a lot of contact with animals, the places where these viruses were jumping into human populations. And we were able to collect a whole range of specimens. We now have probably close to 100,000 specimens from humans and animals in the various sites that we work in. We identified a range of new viruses, including some retroviruses. So retroviruses, for those of you who don't know, is the family of viruses that includes HIV. And we documented evidence of ongoing transmission of some of these viruses into human populations. Okay, and just to tell you a little bit about some of the viruses that we discovered, and I'm going to talk later about a brand new discovery that we had right before I end the talk. But so these are novel retroviruses, HTLV3 and HTLV4. These viruses fall into the family of HIV. These are viruses which we were surprised to see. They're animal viruses that come from primates, and they were present in the hunters that we hunted in Cameroon. And this was shocking for us, the idea that even after we understood how HIV entered into humans and the potential devastation it can cause, that there were viruses that were continuing to enter into humans, these retroviruses that we were completely unaware of. And now what we've done is we've generated diagnostic tests to help us test for these particular viruses so that we can now look to see if some of these things may very well be spreading in human populations, or at least to be prepared so that we can protect blood banks and other sources where people have blood from these possible agents if they're in human populations. In addition, we found a novel pox virus. Many of you may be familiar with smallpox, one of the most devastating viruses to the human population in human history. And again, there are novel pox viruses that people are being exposed to. This is something potentially of major importance. After smallpox was eradicated, we stopped vaccinating people with the smallpox vaccine, vaccinia, which means that right now, all of you and most people in the world are completely susceptible to these novel pox virus infections. Now, you may sort of be thinking to yourself, well, not to worry, this is the middle of some forest in Central Africa or Asia. How are these things going to get out? But again, sort of alluding back to your last symposium on globalization, we live in a very interconnected world right now, and this fundamentally changes the nature of the way that viruses, just like information or anything else, moves around. In the same sort of way that you can't control the spread of information, no matter how hard you may try, it's very difficult to control these viruses. These are logging trucks which harvest logs, but they don't only move logs. What they do is they also move people who may be infected with viruses in very rural areas. They also sometimes move bushmeat, these kind of animals who are hunted from rural areas to urban areas, and this provides a mechanism for connecting urban areas with these very rural areas where these things are occurring. And I think, again, this sort of slide speaks for itself. What happens in Central Africa doesn't stay in Central Africa. And I think really, in some ways, our world of understanding the movement of infectious diseases and pandemics is most sort of perfectly illustrated by this slide. If you go back, even 60 or 70 years, we lived in a world where there was little connection between human populations. Sure, you had boats and you had some cars, but we now live in a world where we move around from one continent to another in the course of hours. And we don't just bring along ourselves, we bring along all of the microorganisms that exist in our gut and our bloodstream, and it connects all these human populations in a way that really facilitates, perhaps for the first time in human history, this incredible mixing and movement of these particular viruses. So, armed with this knowledge, the idea was, we said, okay, well, we know we can get to a place like rural Central Africa. We can work with populations which they said would be very difficult to work with. We can get high-quality specimens. We can understand the behaviors of these individuals. At that point, we really said, look, maybe it's time that we expand this effort. And we approached Google.org and the Skoll Foundation and said, hey, we have this idea. We want to really begin what we now call the Global Viral Forecasting Initiative. And the basic idea is to say, let's not just take one hunter or 1,000 hunters in Central Africa. Let's take people who are exposed to animals throughout the world and enroll them into a study where we follow these individuals. When they get sick, we look at what causes their illness. Is it something which we're familiar with? Is this malaria? Is this a known pathogen? Or is this something completely novel? And then we use some incredible new technologies to study and try to discover these new viral things that may be in these individuals. And we were fortunate, and they agreed to sponsor us. And then we were able to increase the number of sites we worked in. Outside of just Cameroon here, we began work in Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. We began work in Malaysia and in China as well. And the basic idea here is that it's not just these hunters in Central Africa. People all throughout the world, whether it be I was talking last night to Katie at dinner, and she was talking about the work that she was doing with hunters right here in Missouri. So the point is, people throughout the world have contact with animals. This is a picture that many of you may remember from the SARS pandemic. Okay, so SARS is actually originally a virus of bats. But it's a virus of bats that jumped into civets, which is an animal a little bit like a mongoose, and then into individuals who work in these sort of wet markets or live animal markets in China. And that's the way that SARS really entered into human populations. So the basic idea is not simply to look at wild game hunters in Central Africa, but to look at critical populations in hotspots, viral hotspots, place where we see a lot of diversity of animals and viruses, and to monitor these individuals. So whether it be a wet market worker in China, or perhaps a wildlife veterinarian who's collecting samples in South America, or perhaps a deer hunter here in Missouri. The point is that we can create a system whereby we follow these individuals and we can catch these particular viruses early before they spread. And this is the case with you name a particular virus, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end of this, and also there's going to be a breakout session. But you think of any particular new virus you want to, whether it be H1 or Ebola, and these things generally come from animals, and it's this process of connection with these animals. And really what we want to do is just get at that interface and study things. Now this is really what we want to do. So now we're in a new stage, looking for additional resources, looking for additional collaborators. What we want is to build a safety net that actually monitors individuals just like this throughout the world, and ideally catches these viruses at an early stage, which allows us to respond. Now I thought it would just be fun to tell you a little bit about some of the upcoming activities that we have. Democratic Republic of Congo, for some of you who have taken courses in African studies, it's an absolutely fascinating place with a very complicated history. This is a country which is almost the size of all of Western Europe, and yet it has less than 250 miles of road in the entire country. So but it has some of the most incredible diversity of animals in the world and a lot of contact, and this is a place which we think is probably central for these. So you could ask yourself, how are we going to be able to get from place to place and actually do these studies? What we're currently planning is an expedition by boat to go down the Congo River and to work with populations who have high exposure to animals to see what gets them sick and to actually be able to understand and catch some of these viruses even in some of the most rural parts of the planet. Another interesting and exciting initiative that I thought might be of real interest to folks in this community and at this age is work that we're doing with an organization called Frontline SMS. So believe it or not, one of the places that we visit on this boat in Congo is a little city called Loja. Now Loja, you can't get there by road. It's impossible to get there by road. You can only get there by boat. So you can kind of think of it as an island, even though it's right in the heart of Africa. Now, this is a place where there's really no electricity. But what you see, surprisingly, you walk around and you see individuals who are using cell phones. Not a huge number, but there are people that use cell phones, and people will go and pay a little bit of money to use somebody's cell phone. And you may ask yourself the question, how is it possible that these individuals have cell phones in a community that doesn't even have electricity? And and I was asking myself the same question. And what happens is at night, you're walking in the night market, and it's lit up by little kerosene lamps. You know, very incredibly beautiful sight. And then you hear the noise of this little generator, and somebody is sitting there with a generator under a simple wooden table, and they've got plugs on the top of it that are plugged into the generator, and you pay, 20 cents or 5 cents, 15 cents, and you can actually charge your battery just off this particular generator. So one of the things that this gives us an indication is that people want communication in such a profound way that it may be that communication reaches some of these places before electricity, before good water, etc. And this, from our perspective, is really potentially very good news, because it means that we can increase the ability for ourselves to monitor these particular viruses. And so we're working with this group called Frontline SMS. They're not looking for BlackBerries or iPhones. They want these simple phones that have been discarded, that now we buy these kinds of really these simple old cell phones for maybe $5 or $10. And there's a system that they've created which aggregates text messages. So we can give these to hunters in these villages, and when they see animals that have died in the forest, which can sometimes be an indicator of, say, an Ebola outbreak, which kills chimpanzees and gorillas sometimes before it kills humans, they could text message into this system, and it sort of aggregates, crowdsourcing information about viruses and disease from humans or animals, from perhaps the exact critical people that we need to follow these things on. And there's just little tricks to it. Like, for example, one of the things we found is that in these poor communities, even though a text message is not necessarily so expensive, it's very difficult for people to come up with the money to send a text message. What this program does is it'll automatically re-up the phone so that their credit is increased after they send the text message. And what we're hoping is that through systems like this, we can get more and more detailed information about the distribution of these viruses. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of our sort of recent findings, which we're really excited about. And this is actually one of the first times that I've presented this information to a public audience. So just recently, we actually came up with, believe it or not, we discovered the origin of malaria. And this is something that you may be sort of thinking to yourself, isn't malaria, the origin of malaria, mosquitoes? Okay, and that's a good question. Certainly malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, okay, and we don't say anything about that. The way that this particular parasite moves from human to human or from animal to animal is through mosquitoes. But the reality is, we weren't sure if this particular parasite has been in human populations forever or jumped into human populations. And what we did is we looked out into animals to see, are there close relatives of the human malaria parasite out there? And what actually had been seen a little bit before our work was that chimpanzees had a parasite that was very close to malaria parasite. Now, for many of you who may not be familiar with malaria, malaria is an absolutely devastating disease for the human population. It's a disease which has affected humans really since, as far as we know, as old as written history. Sometimes if people ask me to sort of try to illustrate how important malaria is, if you think about HIV, and you think about, everybody knows how important HIV is. Think about HIV as being a tsunami, as being like this big tsunami, or think about it as being like a hurricane, like Katrina. If you want to think about the impact of malaria, think about a hurricane like Katrina, which has been hitting humans every day for the last 1,000 years. Okay, so this is an incredible burden. Now, we're very fortunate in the United States that we've eradicated malaria here, but this is a parasite that continues to have a huge impact on human populations. And it was surprising to us that we didn't actually know where this thing came from. Yet there was this incredible clue that chimpanzees, our closest living relative, had a parasite which was very much related to our own parasite. Okay, and this is sort of the one slide of science, of real science that I'm going to give you. So I'll try to walk you through it. There's 3 different possible explanations, right? So if we want to understand how it is that malaria originates, and we know we've got lots of these parasites in humans, and we've looked out there and we found one parasite that exists in chimps, okay? And we know that humans and chimps are the closest living relatives. They share an ancestor maybe 5 to 7 million years ago, okay? So there's 3 possible explanations. One of them is that you have the common ancestor of humans and chimps. Okay, so this is a parasite that infected the common ancestor between humans and chimps. As humans and chimps evolved separately along different lineages, this parasite changed slowly over time, and you had a parasite in chimpanzees, a parasite in humans, and these were quite different parasites. Another possibility is this is a human parasite. And this is a human parasite that at some point in time jumped over into chimpanzees. And the reason why we see it in chimps is not because they've had this for 5 million years since we shared a common ancestor, but it's simply a human parasite that jumped over into chimps. And then a final possibility, and this is the one that people thought was least likely, was that this was really a very diverse chimpanzee parasite that had jumped over into human populations. And you may ask yourself, well, how would you really be able to sort out between these different possible hypotheses? And the answer is, one way you can do it is by comparing carefully the diversity of genetic information in the human malaria parasites and in the chimpanzee parasites. Now, the problem was we only had one chimpanzee parasite. And so what we did is we went out and we sampled a whole range of different chimpanzees. And we were fortunate to find 6 or 7 different parasites. And then what we can do is compare the diversity. And I'll tell you here what we saw. And this is the way that you sort of represent the diversity of this genetic information is on these particular trees. And so, I don't know if you can see that very well, but if you see this circle that I've drawn here, these are the human malaria parasites. And again, we have thousands of these. We have tons and tons of sequence data. But what we find is no matter how many of these human malaria parasites we sequence, there's very limited diversity. They're almost all virtually identical. And then what we do is we look at the diversity of the chimpanzee parasites. And even though we've only got 7 examples of this, the diversity is much, much greater than what we see in humans and completely encompasses the diversity within the human parasites. And what that leads to is the answer that this is really the way that it happened. This is a parasite of chimpanzees that jumped over into human populations. Okay? And you may ask yourself, okay, well, that's an interesting historical story. Yes, this is a very important parasite of human populations. Now we know the answer to it. And that's one of the answers, but there's also quite a bit more significance here. What we have now is all these different parasites, which are very diverse, similar to human malaria, but distinct. And what we hope is that one of these may be capable of protecting against malaria without causing disease, and therefore be capable of acting as a vaccine. So this is something that we think is potentially quite useful and important. I'm going to end my last few slides by just trying to put some of this into context. It's certainly the case that there are some nasty viruses out there. And my day-to-day working job is to try to understand them and catch them early. But I think it's really important to point out that, in fact, these viruses are part of a much broader ecosystem which is in, on, around us, and which really covers our entire world. if an extraterrestrial were to arrive on the planet and really be tasked with the responsibility of writing the Encyclopedia of Life, think to yourself sort of how humans would fit into this encyclopedia, how plants would fit in, how animals would fit in. Well, the reality is, if we actually chart out the diversity of life on the planet, 27 out of 30 volumes of this Encyclopedia of Life would be devoted to microorganisms, to bacteria, to viruses, to the sibling species of bacteria, the archaea. These are really the most dominant forms of life on the planet. They're the most numerous forms of life. They're the oldest forms of life. They represent the greatest biomass of life on our planet. We can't see them, but in fact, this is the majority of life on Earth. And so, an interesting question that I sometimes pose to people is, if you had a switch on the wall and you could flip that switch and instantly destroy all the viruses on the planet, would you choose to flip that switch? And many people understandably say, oh yeah, of course I would flip that switch. Who wants HIV? Who wants influenza? Who wants all the hassle with that? But the reality is, these are the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of viruses on the planet, and there's a tremendous diversity of them, are completely neutral for humans, and some of them are quite essential. Right now, viruses are controlling bacterial populations in the ocean systems. They're exchanging genes which are permitting various sorts of phytoplankton and other things to permit more appropriate photosynthesis. They're doing all sorts of important and central things for our ecosystem. And one of the things that, particularly for a group like you, what are you going to study? You're at this wonderful point in your life where you have the decision to do anything you want. You can study ecology. You can make it your life's mission to control the bushmeat crisis. You can go into non-proliferation of nuclear or biological weapons. You can do anything with your world. You can do business or law. Many people at an earlier point in time would have been very interested in sort of exploration. And I think many of you will be doing exploration in your own ways. But I think that right now people think, okay, biological exploration. Are we really going to find a new species of primate? Are we really, how much excitement is there? Go back to the time of Linnaeus. Go back to the time in the 19th century where you had major explorers like Charles Darwin or Alfred Russel Wallace that were finding new species of animal. Haven't we really passed the golden age of discovery in biology? And I would say to you that that's absolutely we have not. Because the vast majority of life on this planet are these microbial forms of life. They hold the cures to cancer, the cures to HIV, perhaps the cures to major climate crises, and we understand almost nothing about this incredibly diverse form of life around the planet. So there's still a tremendous potential for biologists to go out and explore things. We don't have to wait 6 or 7 years to discover new species. We are constantly discovering new forms of microorganism. And even though this is sort of an unseen world that we don't have a necessarily day-to-day consciousness of, these are the primary parts of our world, and they remain largely unexplored. And I certainly would encourage all of you to think about that as just one possible route or avenue. And with that, I will leave you with sort of one of my favorite graphic representations of this viral world. This is in fact the most common organism on the planet. This is the most common form of life on the planet. It's a phage it's a virus which is called a bacteriophage. And this is a virus which infects bacteria. And since bacteria are probably the most numerous forms of cellular life on the planet, these viruses which specialize on them are even more numerous. If you actually line these things up end to end, they would be the length of that line would be so great that it would actually be greater than the diameter of the Milky Way galaxy, okay? And we understand almost nothing about these things. Yet, I think that understanding them has a great potential to change our lives and certainly to influence global health. And with that, I will say thank you and be open to questions. Yes, and just ask for people to speak up a little bit. Feel free to yell. just to repeat the question is, to what extent are we getting support from U.S. government, governmental entities for the kind of work that we're doing? And it's a really good question. And the answer is, there's a little bit of a parallel, I think, to individual level medicine. Okay, so we all know now that not smoking, fastening a seatbelt, that prevention is a much better way to address healthcare, right? It's a much more cost-effective way to address care, is to prevent something from happening than from trying to cure it. What we haven't done yet is to witness this sort of transition in population level things, okay? So what we really are right now, if you think about the way that we address global pandemics, it's a little bit like a cardiologist in the 50s or 60s. Okay, so imagine you went into your doctor and you said, well, I've got some history of heart disease in my family, I have elevated blood pressure, and pretty much what the response was, oh, don't worry, you may have a heart attack, but if you do, we've got all kinds of good ways of treating you, we've got surgery. You'd look at your physician like they were a lunatic. Obviously you've got to prevent these things, but we're like that early cardiologist in the 50s right now with regards to pandemics. We haven't reached the point in time where it's general logic to people that we need to actually prevent these things, and it's much more efficient if we can actually prevent them. But I think that the opinion is starting to change a little bit. We're starting to see organizations like USAID, the US government's international development arm, which is increasingly becoming interested in this. Certainly a whole range of my colleagues at the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health are interested. But believe it or not, this is still considered sort of high-risk research, and is still considered to be a little bit on the radical side, which for me seems crazy. It just seems very intuitive. Yeah, absolutely. To what extent, just repeating the question, to what extent is this sort of perspective going to become global? And I think it really is, and that's really the only way that we're going to be able to address these issues, because we're very sort of obsessed with national boundaries, and I think actually your symposium next year is going to be on conflict. But the reality is, when it comes to biology and energy and many of the things that are really pressing for us, these are artificial distinctions. You saw that slide that was air connections between different places in the world. It doesn't matter how nationalistic you are, that's not going to change the rate at which viruses move from place to place. So this is definitely going to have to be something which we're going to address as a planet if we're going to be successful at pulling this sort of stuff off. Next question. Yes.
Dr. Wolfe, you talked earlier about how you monitor viral chatter. What, if anything, is viral chatter telling you?
It's a good question. The question is, what is viral chatter telling us at the moment? So what are we currently seeing in terms of viruses jumping around, which is of interest to us? Certainly, one of the things that we're very curious about is some of these new retroviruses that we've seen. And I have some preliminary results that we'll be releasing over the next 6 months that tells a little bit more about that particular story. Needless to say, influenza viruses, I think, are on everybody's brain these days. And just to take a moment to walk you through what happens with influenza viruses, these are actually, believe it or not, all the flu viruses are viruses which originate in birds, okay? And if you think about it historically, a lot of these viruses actually need big populations in order to fuel themselves. And humans, yes, we have 6 billion people today, but if you go back 1,000 years ago, we were really, had a much different sort of population. And if you go back 50,000 years ago, you're talking about populations that are really small and not capable of really maintaining these viruses. What you have now is humans everywhere, our domestic animals everywhere, and as we interact with things like birds, these viruses are capable of jumping around, so jumping from a bird into a pig, and from a pig into a human, and then mixing themselves, because these viruses have incredible potential to mix around. And so part of the answer to the question is, what we're interested in is a combination of viruses that exist often in these populations that are large populations that now have the potential to enter into human populations. And definitely influenza is certainly one of the things that's definitely on our agenda. Yes? Yeah, so the question relates to sort of what do we see as being the future of HIV and our ability to address it. Certainly, having started this work 10, 15 years ago, we've already come a tremendous way now where even in fairly rural parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there's often access to life-saving drugs, these antiretroviral drugs, and this is something which needs to continue to be pushed. But one of the questions for me is also, are we really done seeing HIV emerge? Okay? So the mindset probably of most of the people in this audience and most of the people in the world is HIV, this is something that entered into humans at one point many, many years ago. It was bad luck, it spread around, and now we've got to deal with it. But the point is, there's nothing to say that viruses just like HIV may not be continuing to enter into human populations. Okay? And so while we need to be focused on things like HIV vaccines, we also need to be focused on all of these other viruses that are just like HIV. Not only these retroviruses I discovered, there's other viruses in a whole range of primates that are even closer to HIV, and we continue to find this. Some of you may have remembered the news report about 2 or 3 months ago of a brand new form of HIV which was found in an individual in Paris. Okay, so these viruses have the potential to continuing entering into human populations. And one of the things that we do, I think, at our own peril is that we forget that this is something which just happened, within the last 100 or 200 years, and there's nothing stopping it from continuing to happen. Next question. Yes? So the question is, in addition to research, what are the other activities in terms of education and prevention which are going on in some of the projects that we do? And believe it or not, the majority of work that we do in the field is actually not research work. A lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis is basic public health. And our major objective is to do research, but if you're working in a place that does not have enough in terms of basic healthcare, one of the things you have to do to begin with is to address basic issues of prevention and healthcare. So we spend a tremendous amount of time even just on HIV and malaria, garden variety diseases, not necessarily new and emerging diseases. With regards to changing behaviors, this is really a fundamental question, and it's a very difficult question. Okay, so anytime somebody comes into your community, try to imagine somebody coming into your community and saying, yeah, we know that you like to, eat beef and pork and fish from time to time. We really think you should stop eating beef. And it's not to say that you can't make some progress on that, but that's a very challenging task. Most people are going to be like, I'm eating my hot dog, I'm eating my burger, it's just not going to happen. And so how do you go about changing some of these approaches to eating food? And it is a real big challenge. One of the things that we've done is we've focused on things that we can really communicate clearly. So in these parts of the world, animals that are found dead in the forest can be infected with Ebola. So we say to people very clearly, we know that you should avoid touching dead animals. This is something that can lead to disease, and it's crystal clear. The other thing that we say is you should avoid, to the extent that you possibly can, direct contact with blood. So if there's ways that you can wrap the meat, if there's ways that you can, if you have a cut, we encourage you not to be butchering meat. But for many of, I don't know, just out of curiosity, so how many people are hunters or have been hunting? If you could raise your hands. Okay, so if you're familiar with hunting, and butchering of animals, to say, okay, well, we don't want you to have blood contact while you're butchering an animal, that's not really possible. You know, it's no one's going to be wearing gloves 24/7. So there's some really difficult questions about how we're going to address these things. And I think one of the things that we found fairly recently is we asked people just sort of, what meat would you like to eat? And one of the things that we were surprised by is that in many of these communities, people actually quite wanted domesticated meat. They would take chicken, they would take, you know, fish. These were things that they very much wanted to have, but they actually didn't have access to those forms of domestic meat. So I think one of the things that's probably needed are massive efforts, probably World Bank funded international efforts to try to change access to domesticated animals. Now, domesticated animals have their own problems as well, but I think that overall we'll be in a much better situation if we were able to decrease contact with wild animals. And I think we still have time for some more questions. Yes? Good question. And again, some of you may have been familiar with this finding. It was in the news this summer, is that for really many years, we always sort of felt like probably HIV in chimpanzees did not cause disease in chimpanzees. And what we found is that over time, if you actually monitor chimpanzees very carefully, what you find is that you can actually detect illness associated with those individuals who are infected with a chimpanzee version of HIV. And I think that's probably the case for many, many more of these diseases, is that if if you're not studying carefully what's going on in these animal populations, you assume that they're healthy with these particular diseases. But if you studied them carefully enough, you would actually find that there was potentially important health consequences associated with infection by these diseases. The other thing that we do see from time to time is what you think of as sort of animal die-offs. So it's absolutely the case that every once in a while, if we watch carefully, there are large groups of animals that will die. And this is something which has been happening intensely in Central Africa. And actually, it seems to be moving in a wave. We still don't understand exactly how Ebola works, what its basic ecology is, where it comes from. These are one of the questions we're trying to answer. But what we do know is that certain animals, like these sort of small forest antelopes, chimpanzees and gorillas, it will kill those animals. And so these diseases can also be completely devastating for animal populations that they infect, but we're really just beginning to sort of understand how that works. Okay.
Dr. Wolfe, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very big thank you to Dr. Wolfe for that entertaining, challenging and thought-provoking beginning to the symposium.